Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola, North America's first place city. In this series of episodes, we've been talking about life on the farm as we had it in early times, beginning way back in Spanish and British periods, then of course trying to follow it step by step after we became part of the United States. And we've dealt with how the land was cleared, how the family built its house, the way the home itself was laid out, what the facilities they had in there, the jobs and the chores that the family and the children had, and then of course the crops that they grew, what they did with them, the problems that they had. And that basically brought us up into the period of the 1880s and 90s when things began to get a lot easier, because by then it was now possible to buy a lot of the things that they needed by mail order from places like Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward, and the rural free delivery mail service brought them right to their gate, and things began to become a little bit easier. And one of the things I mentioned in the last episode was that probably one of the first things that many of the farmers bought was a windmill, which allowed them to literally pump water out of the ground, and if they were ingenious enough, to transport that water right into the kitchen or into the barn. A wonderful change. Now, as we move into this same period, transportation begins to change as well, and with many different adjuncts to it. Number one, in 1889, work was promoted by a man named William Shipley, Colonel Shipley, who recognized that Escambia County and Santa Rosa County as well had been left out of the opportunity to grow profitably both cotton and tobacco. These crops were being grown and shipped very profitably in the counties about 100 miles to our east, but the soil constituents here just weren't right. The product that was grown with the regular soil here just wasn't very good. So in 1889, with Mr. Shipley's encouragement, they developed in this town what was known as the Agrico Mill. It was a fertilizer company owned and operated by two brothers from Dothan named Kressler. And this fertilizer was very carefully blended so that it had all the nutrients to put in the ground here that had been absent before. And so now, beginning about 1890, it now became much, much more profitable to clear more land and to begin to plant cotton and tobacco. And by the time we go just 10 years beyond that particular date, we see in our port statistics that we were shipping over 100,000 bales of cotton a year and many, many different hogsheads of tobacco. So this was becoming bigger business by the year. And of course, as that happened, each farm became larger. And of course, if you're going to be pass along to deliver material like that you have grown, you've got to have the transportation for it. Now, of course, it is in that period that the farmer begins to organize himself, and the farmers came together and they established in Escambia County what was being done, what was being put together in many parts of the farming community across the United States, and this was known as the Grange. The Grange was an association of the farmers who came together to share information, to share ideas, and then when something was needed politically, the Grange was a kind of a pressure group, if you will, a lobbying group that would come to the county commissioners and say, now look, we need this. And the number one thing that the farmers wanted at that particular time was better roads, what we would today call farm-to-market roads, so they could bring these larger shipments of materials they had grown down into the city, either to the port or to some place that was a kind of a wholesaler. And now, of course, if you've got the product and you've got the roads, now the next thing you've got to have, of course, is the material, the wagon or the transport. And at about this time, we have two companies that are developed in downtown Pensacola. One was the J.E. Howell Company, and the other was run by a man named J.M. Hilliard. And both of these companies had what they called Carriage Works, one of them on Palafox Street, the other on East Garden. And they produced both buggies and farm wagons. Now, the farm wagon was a good-sized vehicle. It could be a little more fancy in some cases, or very plain. And the average farm wagon, which might have carried a ton and a half of a product, cost about $30 to $35. And of course, in addition to the wagon, the farm, if the farmer was becoming more prosperous, he might want to have a buggy so that his wife didn't have to bounce around on the wagon seat going into town. And both Hilliard and Howell also manufactured very beautiful, fancy buggies. And once again, you could buy a very nice two-seater for about $30. And that was part of the oncoming fashion establishment, if you will, for the farmer in this time. Well, as all of this begins to come together, the Agrico company is most successful, and we begin to see all kinds of other things happening for the farmer himself. Now, he becomes much more of a factor in the community, and he begins to experiment. Experimenting is part of any industry, and it's about now that the small farmer and the large farmer begin to experiment with cattle. You see, we've now reached a point about the year 1900 where huge acreage has been cut from the timberlands here, and that left a lot of acreage that was just lying fallow. And so people like P.K. Young at the Southern States Lumber Company and some of the farmers themselves begin to say, well, what we'll do now is clear that land off and we'll replant it in fine pasture grasses. And with that pasture grass, we'll begin to experiment to see if we can't produce a better grade of cattle here that can be sold on the hoof to some other market. And so they began to try that. Now, I wish I could tell you that they were 100% successful, but a lot of experimenting was done, but very little of it was successful. Even Mr. Young, with the great resources that company had, tried it for 2 or 3 years. They covered almost 100,000 acres with those grasses. They brought in all sorts of pure-bred animals and interbred them, but nothing worked too well. So cattle breeding was something of the future for Pensacola. Now, at the same time, of course, we begin to have other things that begin to shape the life of the family. By now, there are more families, and they now have better transportation. So now, across the annual the full year, you begin to see things develop where they have more fun. This is where church revivals begin to be held. This is where families come together for particular holidays once the harvest season is over. This is a time, of course, when because there are more of them, they're more close together, and they know one another better, they begin to help one another more with the construction of buildings, the barn raisings, and so forth that are necessary on the farm. And this becomes a part of life here. Now, by the time, and of course, the one of the things that begins to happen, and of course this goes on. It starts in the period around 1910, but by the time we move just a little bit farther, the idea of the weekend in town begins to change. Now you kind of have to get a vision of this. By the time we get to 1910, 12, 13, the farm wagon, it's still there, but many of the farm families now are investing in something new. This is a Model T Ford. It could be the Model T Ford truck, it could be the touring car, but whatever it was, the Model T vehicle allowed the farmer to move very quickly from his farm into the city. And what became a kind of a fashion, and this was true in Pensacola as it was in Marietta, Shipley, Bonifay, other places across the Panhandle. What you would see was this. The chores are ended about noon. And now all the family loads into the car, and they bring with them what we would today call the makings of a tent. They have some cook pots, and they may have some things that they are going to sell or trade in town. And into town they go, and they find a place to park right along, in Pensacola, it would have been right along what we today call Plaza Ferdinand VII. They stop, they get out, and for the next few hours, the children run this way, the homemaker goes this way, the farmer goes here. Each one has a place where he or she wants to go. Now the farmer, of course, has some things he wants to get at the hardware store, or at the livery stable, or something like that. The farm wife, she heads for the general store to get those things which she could not get readily through the mail or easily. The youngsters, well, they go off to find their friends and just have a good time. And of course, all of this goes on throughout the afternoon, and we come to the evening hour, and people begin to congregate in the park, and they just have fun together. They they sing. They have brought their musical instruments with them. It's just a good old-fashioned get-together and have fun. Now, it's getting a little dark now, so what they do next is to put up the little shelter that they brought with them, and they literally camp in the park overnight. So that when they get up the next morning, they quickly put on their best bib and tucker, and now they all go to church. And once the church service is over, then of course they go back, put everything back together, get in their Model T Ford, and go back home. So basically, for a number of years, this sort of arrangement was done so that coming into town was a big part of life on the farm. Well, now, as all of this comes up, of course, we're beginning to see the change for children. If we went back to the year 1885, when the Escambia County Public School System began, very few of the farm children got much of a formal education. P.K. Young, however, insisted that the arrangement would be made for building schools in the community, where many times this teacher was literally boarded with the farm families, but they had difficulty getting back and forth because they had to be hauled. The children had to be hauled back and forth in farm wagons, and of course they had to accommodate the school year to the farm year. But by the time we get into the 20th century, this is beginning to change. Now, by the time we get into the teens of the 19 teens, we are now shifting from having farm wagons or things of that kind to take children to school. Now the first school buses have been bought, and people are moving back and forth. And so basically, we can say that by the time we get into the 1920s, education has just come right literally out of the ground for the rural children, and many more are going to school, not just for a couple of years to learn the basics, but now they are also going on and completing high school. And of course, this is one of the reasons that we have Tate High School in our community today, a school that in those days particularly concentrated on studies that would benefit the farm. Well, farming is going all right until we get to the 1930s. And then, of course, the Great Depression struck not only Pensacola, but all across the Southeast. And what began to happen, of course, was that there was a glut of farm products. The poor farmer, particularly those up in Georgia or Alabama, they could not get back in sales of their product what they put out in fertilizer and tools and seeds for it. And so by the time we get to 1931, there are huge numbers of people coming off of those farms. They're desperate. They're looking for a place where they'll find shelter or food or a job or help. And many of them come to Pensacola and literally are here looking for whatever kind of help the community will give them. And to Pensacola and Escambia County's great credit, private citizens and the governments themselves did their best. And while they didn't have a lot to give, they did something. Well, as you saw that happen, by the time we get through the period of the Depression, farming begins to change, because by now what used to be the family farm with an individual family able to produce enough for their own use and have some surplus to sell, now this begins to change as farm mechanization gets much broader and the farms become much larger, and what basically used to be a family farm now becomes a farm business. And step by step we see the acreages become larger, and this of course is certainly true across the bread basket, the middle of our country, and it certainly was true in Escambia County as well. So as we move into the 21st century, what used to be a situation where roughly 90% of all the people who lived in the county were farmers, that has changed so that today, as we look at the 21st century, fewer than 10% of the residents, the population of Escambia County, make their living that way. But we can look back, of course, and see some of the things with a great memory. Unfortunately, we don't see this anymore, but once upon a time, we used to ride down the highway here, going up Highway 29, and we would see some of the first billboards that we had in our community were painted on the sides of barns. We saw the farmer was the place who was the purveyor of fresh vegetables. So if you drove your car up and down the highway, you would almost certainly see a stand out of the side of the road where you could stop and get corn and tomatoes and whatever fresh vegetables you want. That sort of thing, unfortunately, is slowly fading away. Now, looking back, the farm has played a huge part in Escambia County's life. The life of the farmer was very unusual. I hope this little series has given you an idea of how things used to be back on the farm.